Welcome to everyone. Greetings to everyone, and great to see so many people here at the height of the summer. I mean, lovely summer we're having. And just to sort of pre-announce, we've got a couple of things coming up. We've got someone coming from Bly now talking about the community enterprises he set up there. I think something amazing, like 14 of them or something. It's a very interesting thing that they're doing in Bly na Festiniog, and there is an ex-academic from Bangor who's sort of the moving spirit behind it all, so he'll be here. And the one after that I want to mention, because we're getting someone from the Hinckley area, Bridgewater, the editor of the Bridgewater Mercury, who is going to tell us about what difference Hinckley has made to their community, which he says is a big, big difference. And if Wilver happens, we might experience something similar. And I'm just mentioning it because I'd be very interested. Is there anyone who knows anyone who's been involved in the Hitachi bid and the Hitachi project and getting that nuclear thing, trying to get that nuclear thing to happen? Is anyone? I was hoping someone might know someone who we could ask to tell us what the status of the plant is and whether it's going to happen and all that sort of thing. No. Well, anyway, if anyone did hear of some, yeah.
Well, we know someone who's involved in buying the land.
Well, yes, I think I know what you mean. But I think I need someone more who actually understands where the bid is with Rolls-Royce and all the other options they've got. Anyway, if anyone heard of someone like that, I'd be very grateful, because we could get them to come on the same evening, and it would make it a fuller sort of understanding of what's going on. But more importantly, tonight, we've got Marjie Griffiths, who many of you will know, and is teaching in Nottingham, and is the lead teacher there on teaching and learning, and very importantly, is the daughter of David Griffiths, who started this organisation, who was a brilliant person and left this for us, a wonderful thing he created here. And we're very grateful to her father, and really pleased that she's come to continue his tradition. And even better, he was good at marmalade, she's better at jam, and I'm getting a jar, I'm told, which is good. So and you are also a performance poet. I don't know if we're going to hear that. So lots of things. So you're going to tell us about the art of telling a story.
Thank you. I'm just going to turn this on. Make sure. Thanks, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Great, lovely. Well, I'll kick us off with some immortal words then. Once upon a time, in a land far, far away, beyond 9 seas, beyond 9 lagoons, back when tigers smoked tobacco, a story, let it come and let it go. Magical words from around the world that tell us that we are going on an adventure, but it's a safe one. It's an adventure where we're protected from any threat by time and distance, but an adventure nonetheless. So for the next 20 minutes or so, I'd love for you to join me on a brief adventure through the world of storytelling, and we'll touch on why stories are important, what they're for, and some techniques that writers, storytellers, playwrights, and movie directors use to draw us in and hold us there. I put it to you that from creation stories to podcasting, storytelling is an intrinsic part of the human experience. It's a space where we can explore the universal fears and fantasies that transcend the day-to-day experience of whatever age we find ourselves living in. Stories are, quite simply, the stuff of life. Some stories are mirrors. We peer into them to see our own experiences reflected back at us, and those stories tell us that we're never alone, that generation upon generation have felt before as we're feeling now. And some stories are windows, allowing us to look into the experiences of others and learn from them. Stories have been around for as long as we have, and they reflect the universal experiences of humankind. The ancient Greeks experienced fear, loneliness, joy, love, just like we do, as did the Elizabethans, the Georgians, and I'm sure even prehistoric man. In fact, cave paintings from as far back in time as 30,000 BCE show images that are believed to be part of a storytelling tradition, where images were used to communicate stories of hunts, rituals, and significant events. These early forms of storytelling were not just about entertainment, but served practical purposes such as teaching younger generations about the dangers of the world and the values of community. Fairy tales, Aesop's fables have the same purpose. These stories, rooted in oral tradition, are told in order to educate and to entertain. From our elders, we learn not to judge books by their covers. We learn to trust our instincts but not be impulsive. We learn when to fight, when to flee. We learn to recognize danger before it's too late. From Rumpelstiltskin, we learn to pay attention to the fine print before we sign any contracts. From Seithanin, we learn not to get drunk when we've got an important job to do. And from Little Red Riding Hood, girls learn from a young age, don't talk to weirdos in forests. Above all, we learn to be good and we learn to listen to our elders. Jamie Tirani, Professor of Anthropology at Durham University, has spent his career looking at the history of stories and storytelling and of why stories are important. He's traced one particular storyline that's appeal is so universal that he's confirmed its existence in all surviving Indo-European cultures. We've been telling this particular story for centuries across continents, and that's various variations on the devil and the smith. The devil or a demon appears to someone and they offer extraordinary opportunity or extraordinary wealth in return for your soul. It crops up, of course, in Faust, in Hans Christian Andersen's version of The Little Mermaid as well, which I would argue is much better than the Disney version. The mermaid chooses to die and keep her soul and ascend to heaven as sea foam rather than kill the prince in order to return to her family when he chooses the love of another. Again, way better than the Disney version, I think. Crops up in more modern legends as well. The iconic guitarist Robert Johnson allegedly achieved success on the Mississippi music scene by selling his soul to the devil at a local crossroads. Now, he died in the late 1930s, but nobody knows quite how or why. On his death certificate, it says where he died, it says when he died, cause of death is blank. Now, some say that he was poisoned by the husband of his lover. Some say it was syphilis. Some say that the devil came to collect his dues. We'll never know. And for those of you who enjoy a slightly more modern flavour of music, Tenacious D spoofed the Faustian legend with their 2001 song Tribute, in which a demon played by Dave Grohl from Nirvana and the Foo Fighters waylays two musicians on a long and lonesome road. The point I'm trying to make is that it's rare to find anything unique in storytelling, and that is the joy of it. It's all based on connection, commonalities, universalities, things that help us to relate to one another. So whilst there may always be a drive to find the next new thing, what's the new big thing, what we're actually all seeking in many ways is just more of the same, more validation and more recognisable story arcs. With that in mind, we can actually break stories down into quite specific patterns that really serve to scratch a psychological itch. So yes, storytelling, it's an art form, it's a craft to be nurtured and developed. Not just anyone can tell a great story, but there's also a science to it. David Phillips is a communications expert who defines story not by their genre, but by the hormones that they release in our brains. Oxytocin stories, for example, we tend to experience oxytocin release in response to feeling deep empathy for a character that we relate to. Testosterone levels in readers and listeners generally tend to increase when main characters encounter a high level of risk. So there are plenty of techniques that storytellers and writers can use to elicit a real physiological response in us. Well deployed, I'd argue that stories are the most powerful force wielded by humankind. The pen is mightier than the sword, and words have the power to change the world. An example of this is how we're motivated to vote, by how much we relate to the stories told to us by the politicians vying for our votes. Donald Trump arguably won the 2016 US presidential election because of his team's exploitation of powerful storytelling skills, their ability to draw their audience in. If we look at Make America Great Again, their slogan, it's just 4 words, but it infers a narrative structure. The protagonist is the average American. The audience, they're given a clear mission with one imperative phrase: Make America Great Again. It's a story that any knuckle-dragger can understand, and its veracity is beside the point. Drain the swamp. In the UK, we had Stop the Boats. Again, We, the audience, are the collective protagonists. There's a clear mission in which we're invited to become the hero. There's an implied threat or antagonist who needs defeating. And there's a binary simplicity to it. There are some baddies, and they're going to come over here and get our jobs. And we're the goodies. And there's a clear and simple answer that if we vote for this guy, we'll achieve our happily ever after. Heroes and villains, missions, adventures, happily ever afters, hard truths, comfortable lies. It's all the same stories being told again and again and again. In fact, Christopher Booker, who founded Private Eye, put forward a theory that there are really only 7 basic plots out there at all, which I'll go into in a minute. And all of these are underpinned by a meta-plot being the following. And to illustrate this, I'm going to use Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Now, it came out some time ago, but if you haven't yet read it or seen it, please look away to avoid any spoilers. First, we've got the anticipation stage. The hero is called to adventure. Now, for Frodo, this is where Gandalf rocks up and says, you know that ring? It might be important. Keep it secret, keep it safe. Then we have the dream stage where the hero sets out. They cross the threshold. Now, for Samwise Gamgee, that's a very real threshold rather than a metaphorical or figurative one. He actually says, certainly in the movies, oh, Mr. Frodo, if I take one more step, I'll be the furthest away from home I've ever been. Oh, it's gorgeous. Progress is made, confidence is built, so Frodo has to get to Rivendell, and on the way he's chased by the Ringwraiths, and he's wounded by a Morgul blade, but ultimately he gets there, he's healed by Elrond, and he experiences some success. And then it gets really bad. We get the frustration stage. The real peril hits, any illusion of invincibility is lost, and it often coincides with the death of the mentor. So Gandalf is apparently lost to the Balrog in the mines of Moria, and Frodo and co have to continue alone. And then it gets even worse. We get the nightmare stage where all hope is lost, and it's only the will of the hero and what they've learnt about themselves that's going to see the hero through to their happily ever after. It's a very sad moment when they're on the sides of Mount Doom, and Sam is trying to cheer Frodo up by saying, do you remember the Shire, Mr. Frodo? And he says that he can't actually remember the taste of strawberries anymore. Oh, it's heartbreaking stuff. And then we get the resolution. The hero overcomes their burden against all the odds and gets their happily ever after. So for Frodo, he encounters a very real representation of what he will become in Gollum if he doesn't have the strength to get rid of the ring. Ultimately, the ring is destroyed, and then there's a very meandering journey back to the Shire, and from there on to the Grey Havens, and Frodo's sort of happy ending. So ultimately, it really boils down to 3 acts. You've got your beginning, your middle, your end. You've got your thesis, your antithesis, and your synthesis. In the beginning, there's ignorance or yearning for something, or both. In the middle, the biggest part of the story, you've got challenge and struggle and learning. And then finally, you get the payoff. There's the application of the learning and hopefully the happily ever after. So how do these apply to the 7 plots? And I wonder if in any of these plots, you might recognise some of your favourite stories. First, we have overcoming the monster. There's an antagonistic force that needs to be overcome. It's a typical good guys versus bad guys situation, and we often see the trope here of the chosen one coming into play, so the only person who can overcome the monster is the least likely person. It's the underdog. It could be the little boy who lives in the cupboard under the stairs. Now, I do have stickers here for correct answers. Goodies versus baddies. Shout out if you know the answer. Harry Potter's nemesis is? Oh, I could give lots of you stickers. I've only got 4. Okay, yes, Voldemort is the antagonist. Okay, what about this one? Theseus. Minotaur, got it. Yes, lovely. Okay, what about Luke Skywalker? Lovely. Sticker for Mark. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to give you a really, really hard one. And I'm not going to give you a picture. Okay, brace yourselves. Chief Brody, Matt Hooper, and Quint. Sticker for you. Excellent. Well done. Yes, those are our protagonists, and there is our antagonist. Fabulous. Okay, plotline number 2 is rags to riches. The protagonist acquires power or wealth or love, then they lose it all, and then they gain it all back again. And they grow as a result of their journey. Obvious example, Cinderella. We also have Aladdin, A Little Princess, The Prince and the Pauper, David Copperfield. Plotline number 3, the quest, which boils down ultimately to get the thing, or destroy the thing, or get to the place. So in Arthurian legend, they're often out for the Grail. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones is out to get the Ark before the Nazis do. In The Lord of the Rings, Frodo actually has an overlap with Overcome the Monster, because in order to defeat Sauron, he has to destroy the ring and get to Mordor. Other way around, get to Mordor, destroy the ring. Hazel Ra has to get to Watership Down to establish a colony. Voyage and return. This may seem very similar to the quest plot. The major difference is that there's not a mission to complete in going out there in the first place. The protagonist just happens to find themselves in a strange new world outside of their usual realm of experience. And then they get to return home with newfound knowledge or confidence. So there's Alice in Wonderland, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, The Lion King, Orpheus, The Hobbit, Brideshead Revisited, Peter Pan. Basically, find yourself somewhere new, learn from it, go home and apply. Number 5, comedy. So this, believe it or not, is not defined by being a barrel of laughs from start to finish. The plot is characterised by humorous characters, a light, cheerful ending. There'll be a central conflict or issue which becomes more and more confusing and difficult for the main character to overcome. And then there'll be one single sort of clarifying event that brings about a cheery resolution. Shakespeare gave us loads of these. Much Ado, Twelfth Night, Taming of the Shrew, Midsummer Night's Dream, and loads of cheesy romances fall into this as well. So Bridget Jones, for example, she lives in a state of perpetual confusion and conflict until she realises it wasn't Mark Darcy who slept with Daniel Cleaver's wife. It was actually Daniel Cleaver who slept with Mark Darcy's wife. And the moment she finds that out, actually she's free to kind of go out there and pursue her love interest and get the guy. Tragedy. The protagonist has a major character flaw, which ultimately leads to their undoing. The picture of Dorian Gray, Hamilton, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Julius Caesar. Here we encounter one of the tropes that I absolutely love. It's called Save the Cat. We have to have a reason to care about our protagonist, despite their obvious flaw. They have to save a proverbial cat for us to like them enough to care when it all goes wrong. So we care about Alexander Hamilton, for example, because we recognise the challenges of his youth and his desperate desire to make a positive impact on the fledgling United States of America. So when he does get shot as a result of his own pride and stupidity, we're actually a little bit sad. Final one, rebirth, which is the same as tragedy, but with an addendum. There's a redemption arc. So the main character has to change their ways to achieve their happy ending. Here's Michael Caine from, I'd argue, the best version of A Christmas Carol, the Muppets one. And of course, he changes his ways to achieve his happily ever after. Now, lots of stories actually feature a real overlapping of lots of these different plots, because most stories have subplots and so on. If, like me, you're a fan of Game of Thrones, you'll know that George R.R. Martin writes his books from a range of different character points of view, each with their own plot and narrative arc, sweeping through this epic. So most of these plot lines don't exist in isolation, but I hope that gives you an idea of some of the plot lines that we really relate to in our human experience, that kind of tickles our senses and provides some real satisfaction. It'd be really boring if there wasn't a good basic plot line. You know, character gets up, has breakfast, has a nice day, gets an early night. That's just a really boring diary. So I'm going to give you a bit of thinking homework, if that's all right, a bit of brain food to chew on as the nights start to close in. Are there any stories that fall outside of the 7 basic plots? I've not been able to think of any, but that's not to say that those stories aren't out there. And in fact, I'm really hoping to see an expansion of these basic plot lines as society evolves. Historically, the people dominating the narrative have been white, Western, male, cisgender, straight or straight passing, and able-bodied. So just thinking about the male-female dichotomy, you know, there's a reason why we refer to the hero's journey when considering major tropes and plot lines. Historically, the spotlight has been fixed on one very specific, very powerful demographic. More recently, we've been seeing the rise to prominence of more marginalised voices, seeing different life experiences reflected and crucially celebrated in our libraries and on our screens. We've seen, for example, the rise of the heroine's journey, which was first kind of pitched in the 1980s and has risen to prominence particularly since the amazing Barbie movie. Yes! And in this, we see something that's more reflective of perhaps a more feminine experience, characterised by internal conflict and internal response to an external crisis, rather than external response to an external crisis. Interestingly, whilst the hero's journey is shown as a circle, the heroine's journey is often shown as a spiral, representing the kind of never-ending continuation of this sort of experiential learning cycle. We just keep going, okay? Now, when Joseph Campbell, the author of The Hero's Journey, was presented with this, his response was that heroine's journey isn't needed, because women don't need to go on a journey, because we are the destination for the hero. Has anybody else just been a little bit sick in their mouths? There's also, just by way of hands, who's heard of the Bechdel test? Nice. So the Bechdel test, a movie or a play passes the Bechdel test. It's a very low bar if there are 2 named female characters and if they have a conversation that's not about a man. So many plays, movies, stories fall flat on their faces. The Lord of the Rings, which has been a bit of a common theme throughout, apologies, in Peter Jackson's extended editions, 11 hours and 36 minutes of footage, I've checked. There's one exchange between 2 female characters. There's a little girl, and she asks Éowyn, shield maiden of Rohan, "Where's Mama?" And Éowyn says, "Shh, that's it." That's all women get in the whole thing. So, given that actually, women represent 51% of the approximation of society, approximately, that's not even considering the experiences of the LGBTQIA+ community. It's not considering the experiences of people with disabilities. It's not reflective of people who aren't white. So I think we can see the need for diversity in the voices that we hear around us. As the doors of acceptance and tolerance and kindness open ever wider, I hope, I'm looking forward to seeing a much wider range of plots and voices being celebrated in our human story. Now, if you're interested in finding out more, these are some of my favourite books about stories, which I'll leave up in a moment, but until then, I'm really, really grateful for your time and your attention, and I wish you all a very happily ever after. The end.
Thank you very much indeed. And just one from me before we get started. You talk about the need to hear different experiences, have different experiences reflected in stories from communities that haven't been represented before in these artistic forms. But is there any evidence that these 7 stories that you're talking about, there are 7 sort of ways of doing this, telling a story, do they apply to all cultures and to all minorities? And I mean, do you think these 7 forms are only relevant to the current output, which is mainly to do with white male privilege?
Okay, I think that's really interesting because, so as a primary school teacher, I'm always really keen that all of the books in my classrooms are mirrors and windows. And I teach a lot of children who are from a huge range of backgrounds. In the books that I have in my classroom, I've never found anything beyond what I find in the 7 basic plots. But I'm aware that I'm reading these as a white British middle class person of great privilege. So I suppose for me an interesting avenue of research would be to look into what others who aren't like me perhaps find in those stories.
And you're open to the idea they may have
Absolutely.
have 8, 9 and 10. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions? Just raise your hand as one.
I wanted to take up the challenge.
Yes.
And about whether there's anything. Well, so I was trying to think, and it's not really fair, but I was thinking. I listened to the Wireless and do the Radio 4, and I was thinking. So there's a sequence towards midnight that's usually got a story, and then there's another thing after it that's called the skewer, which is a melange of lots of different things happening, all integrated, and you make your own story up. Is that a dream?
You were asleep then, yeah?
Maybe it was, yeah. So anyway, the skewer.
Was there a plot, or was it one plot after the other?
It's all mixed up, and lots of stuff that you hear, snippets of information or something you've heard somewhere else, and then it's on to something else.
Change your medication.
Maybe I should.
There's a question here.
Whereabouts? Oh, Andrew.
I detected a sense of "oh God" when. Okay, so I've got two things. The first thing, which I think is the most interesting, is maybe when you're teaching and also when you are delivering this. Are you sort of bringing your experience of like storytelling and the nature of stories to how you communicate? And are there any reflections on that? And then the second thing is in terms of different sort of ways of conceptualizing stories outside of this sort of the paradigm that we've got here. One specific example would be that in East Asian cultures, they have a completely different way of thinking of like plot, whereas instead of considering plot as about conflict in the way that we do in the West, they think of it in terms of revelation. There's this plot structure called Kishokunketsu, where you're presented with a situation, then you're presented with an incongruous part of that situation, and then you're presented with some context which makes it make sense. So you're still sort of like intrigued, you're still sort of like compelled by questions about like what's happening, and you're still getting an interesting resolution, but it's not one that necessarily sort of demands that like people are kind of fighting over like a divergent goals or something like that. So I'd throw that in there. And finally, as an example of a plot which is not one of the 7 basic plots, I would say Waiting for Godot, I guess.
Oh, I can't believe I have to say I've never actually seen or read Waiting for Godot. Hide my head in shame, but I will definitely check it out. But basically, I think the argument is like there has to be something to overcome. So in differing plot lines, and I mean across I think the cultural sort of scope of stories, it all boils down to something to overcome. So whether it happens in sequence or out of sequence. Or wherever the big reveals happen, is that so? Thinking about the kind of plot line you were talking about there in your second question, is there something to overcome?
There's still a question, but the question is more in the viewer's mind rather than in the actions of the protagonist. So the question is rather what's going on rather than what's happening.
So is it almost then kind of you as the reader have to
but
become the protagonist? I think I'd need to read read more about it before I give you any sort of definite answer, but in terms of how it comes into how storytelling kind of comes into my classroom, I think a lot of it boils down to always ask the children what they want to be reading, because yes, I can pick out some really great class readers that we can do together as a team and really enjoy, that hit some of the spelling and grammar and punctuation things that we need to hit and offer a great story, but I'm only kind of offering from my understanding of stories that are in my classroom. And if a little person comes to me and says, this story really made an impact on me, then that's always going to be what we read next.
Yes, there's a microphone, I think, which has been distributed.
Anne.
Hello. Yeah, hi.
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 You're a primary school teacher, presumably across the range of primary? Or
Yeah, I'm currently teaching 7 and 8 year olds, but I've taught across from early years up to year 6.
In this day now, we're very visual with stories. We've got so many visual films or internet and the rest. But you're obviously working with books within school, and is it difficult to draw the children now into the words, the written word of a story? Is it something you're finding they're wanting to do, or is it something that you're having to work hard to do? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really hoping that I can kind of offer a gem of hope here, because sometimes when we open the newspapers and we look on our phones and we're thinking, oh gosh, kids these days are. There's never been a class that I've taught that hasn't been hungry for stories. And actually my gorgeous little nephew's at the back there, and he gobbles them up. But that's been the same experience that I've had with children of all ages, even when I've taught in the senior school that's attached to my school and been sort of drafted in on cover, and finished physics a little bit early and said, hey, should we just have a bit of story? They've just said, yeah, all right. Yeah, let's sack off physics. Let's have some story. I feel like they're hungry for it.
I know that's really refreshing to know, because you do, as you say, you hear that often. It's picking up books is something that's almost alien to actually switch off and switch down.
Yeah,
So
it's harder to get them reading at home.
That was
When
where I
they're
was leading up to.
yeah.
Is it something they want to take on? Is it something that they see as a school? Because it's such a shame, because there's so much in words that can be lost in when you see something.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you get the dialect, but you don't always get the words of action. And
yeah, I completely agree. And I teach a lot of children who have various different learning needs, and I would always argue that audiobooks are just as joyful and fabulous as if you're finding it tricky to access stories through the page. Having a Yoto player or a Tony's box, or having a way of listening to stories and absorbing them in other ways is just as valuable and lovely as finding them through the page.
Yeah.
I promise we've not practiced this, so this is genuinely putting you on the spot.
No.
How do you feel about AI telling stories?
Oh, well, because you've had a lot of success, haven't you,
Yes.
asking ChatGPT to write stories about tractors and trains for Bertie, I think, haven't you? Yeah, great. I think there's a lot of potential there, and I think that, yes, we need to be wary of AI, but not afraid of it. I think it can tell some really fantastic stories, just as long as the grown-up reads them first to check that there aren't any naughty words in it. To just check that the AI has generated something that's age and stage appropriate. But yeah, I think it's a minefield, but an exciting one.
That actually prompts a question I was going to ask, because it suggests the way you present this, that there are 7 story types, and they keep coming up over the centuries in different forms and different art forms and so on. Yeah, it's not very creative, is it? And if AI can do it,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean that might be the homework. Forget the thinking homework. Let's ask ChatGPT and see what it comes up with, because
But where is the room in all this for the creative?
Well, who was it who said that actually we really need ChatGPT and AI to take care of all the washing and the cooking and the cleaning, so that actually we can do the creative stuff rather than the other way around.
Yeah, Roger.
What a lovely talk, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I was wondering, does every story have to happily ever after? Or can you have a thing called a cliffhanger? So you could have a story that goes on forever and it never is happily ever after, because you leave them with something. It's a bit like, I suppose, I haven't watched it, but Game of Thrones, which you have, because you've admitted that, it's probably a bit like that. It's, you want to go back and see the next bit, And there can probably never be a happily ever after. So does that
Yeah.
make it not a story?
I think that's a really great question. I think there has to be a resolution, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a happily ever after. So some of my favourite books end in tragedy. I mean, so one of the best books I've ever read was A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness, in which the protagonist loses his mother to cancer as a child, and it's powerful, it's deeply upsetting, and there isn't a happily ever after, but there's a resolution and sense of closure. I think the thing that a story can't have, if it's going to provide any level of satisfaction for the reader or the listener, is the idea that there's a whole load of untied loose ends, which would then beg a sequel, which Game of Thrones does very cleverly. They always keep you coming back for more.
Thank you.
Perhaps the 7 themes, is that working? The 7 themes have come because they are the history of the people who write stories. That is what, over hundreds and hundreds of years, that's what they've experienced and that's what they've developed. And I think we're stuck with those 7 themes until other cultures do it. And I suggest a really good way will be to put 1 million monkeys in a room with a typewriter. Now, one of them will write sonnets of Shakespeare, guaranteed, but others will come up with other themes. And it's probably, we've got to go away from our current experience level before we'll ever get a new theme. Just thought I'd throw that in.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Actually, one of the things that I will never forget, a moment in primary school that blew my mind when I was about 9, my teacher at the time asked me to write about an alien that experiences emotions that we don't experience. And I think I just sort of sat there buffering, like, oh, how? Because, you know, if we're looking for different plots, if we're looking for different things, we're looking, like, we can't experience what's outside of our experience unless we go and experience it, or we hear about it from others. So who knows, monkeys and typewriters might be the way forward, Dave.
Or AI, yeah.
I mean, following on from that, I wonder to what extent the books or the people write from people living in a particular nation or society are reflective of the society. I rather hope it isn't, because for Christmas a few years ago, Janie gave me a book of short stories, and they were all Welsh short stories by Welsh writers. There were about a dozen of them. They were well written, and with the exception of one, it was miserable ever after.
Well, is that an excuse, Nigel, for you to go and enjoy a bit more shopping in Welsh bookshops and go and find some happy ones?
Yeah.
Thanks, Marjorie. Can you explain this conundrum that kids love stories? We are hardwired to love stories, but when my twins were little, and they loved stories, but when it came to Christmas or birthdays, they would say, if there's one present that is square and flat and thin, I don't want it. And they really got angry if anyone gave them a book.
Oh. Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? And
I just wonder what's the difference. How do you persuade kids that a book is a story and they're going to love it? But they just, and I don't think they were alone. They did not like getting books. They were thought to be boring.
Yeah, absolutely. And I teach so many little reluctant readers who they'll gobble up stories in school when the other option is like we either do more maths or we do stories, and they're like, oh, stories, bring it on. So yeah, I think it's possibly the competing for attention of all the other things that happen at home, and particularly now with screen time and all the things that we like to do at home, like playing with the Lego and doing all these lovely things. It's very hard to get a look in with books and stories, isn't it? I suppose the only way that I would know to kind of really push the stories is to forge those positive relations with that storytelling. So to me, storytelling and books have always been a throwback to when Pippa and I were very little, and Mum would drink her tea and Dad would do his prayers sitting in bed together, and Pippa and I would climb into the middle with the 2 cats, and we'd snuggle up and do stories. And so whenever I read a book, it takes me right back there to a place where I feel safe and warm and loved. And I think probably the greatest gift that we can give to our children is that feeling of safety and security that we then maybe associate with reading. But reading does demand attention and effort. And in a world where we're surrounded by screens and dopamine hits, it's really, really hard to find that space. But I think they just have to sort of learn to find it for themselves, I guess.
So, and in your school, do you try and stop the screen time? Do you try and stop the phones? And
Ultimately, we can't. So when the children go home, they're
But
out
in the
of
school
our control.
environment?
But in the school environment, we use Chromebooks and things when we're typing up our work. But when we're doing stories, we love them off the page, and we love them and listen to them. We try and keep screens out of them as much as we can.
Yeah, Bobby.
Well, I've got an example of a couple of books that I've really loved, and I don't feel that they fit into the 7.
Oh, right, Bobby, bring it on.
But probably unless you read the books, you won't be able to refute this. But one is Catch-22, which is a very well-known book.
Okay.
And it just feels like it's a story about the frustrations of life. It doesn't actually go anywhere, as far as I know, anyway. The other one is The Sympathizer.
And what's The Supervisor?
The Sympathizer. It's similar, you know.
Similar.
Is that a Shaggy Dog story?
No.
No, okay.
Both have gone on my reading list now, Bobby. I'll get back to you.
Okay. I'll look forward to that.
Okay, any more? Yep.
Sorry again. I'd like to respond to the question about presence. In that, I think the conundrum there comes from the fact that I think that storytelling is a social thing. It's something that as a little child you experience as something that you do with your parents. So it might be that when you see a present that is a book, you don't think about that as oh, I'm getting these stories. You think about that as oh, I'm not getting this thing that I can do on my own, which is like a toy or whatever. Whereas what they like about the stories is that they are sort of having that shared with the storyteller. And then they might not be at the stage where they're sort of reading them on their own. And then in response to Bobby's thing, I guess...
Sorry to interrupt, but the answer to that would be they loved getting chocolates and they would eat those on their own.
Fair enough.
There is one of these children. There's someone who should have a comment on this.
No, but I think that's really accurate in that, actually, children live in the present, and actually, it's even as adults, it's quite hard to kind of go, okay, well, if I sit down and I invest this time and effort in opening this book, I will get something really special out of it. When you've got a little person with, who doesn't have a fully developed prefrontal cortex and has no impulse control, no understanding of delayed gratification, a book can be quite a daunting prospect, particularly when the stocking is full of things that go whiz bang flash. And
well, I have to say, I've just discovered TikTok.
It's good, isn't it?
And I'm losing an hour a day to it. And I'm reading less, I'm afraid.
But then maybe they're right. But then maybe on a certain level that they're right, that a story isn't like a piece of property that you own. It's a thing that happens between the storyteller and the audience. But then the other thing that I wanted to respond to with Bobby's point is that I think I agree that at least Catch-22, which is I haven't read The Sympathizer, but I think I agree that Catch-22 doesn't easily fit into this sort of 7 basic plots. But then the question that I would pose to him is, what happens at the end of Catch-22 to make it feel like the random string of nonsense that you've just read has been worthwhile? Because there are plenty of random strings of nonsense that wouldn't end up feeling worthwhile.
That's a tough one, I would say. But I think mostly that it's highlighted to me the sort of alternative view of life, and that the conventional understanding of events is always open to an alternative interpretation, which is very much highlighted in both The Sympathiser and Catch-22.
There's a question here.
Thanks again. Really interesting take, particularly from a teaching point of view. And obviously, you work with lots of different children, lots of different backgrounds. Are there ever children who you don't think have got it, that they don't empathise with the story? And is that indicative of any other emotional or whatever issue? And if so, how do you deal with it? Maybe you don't.
Yes. What does an interest in stories reveal? I
Yeah,
guess.
you know, do they empathise with the wrong person, the anti-hero, rather than that kind of? Do you come across that?
Oh, that's a really great question. I don't think I've ever come across a child who didn't sort of throw themselves in and love stories. I think most commonly, though, you end up with misconceptions where they can't really infer meaning. They struggle to do that kind of reading between the lines, and so they sort of get the wrong end of the stick about what a character might mean or say. So I would say that most sort of hiccups in understanding aren't necessarily about who to empathise with. It's about not understanding the intent of particular characters, particularly when they're reading independently. But yeah, I don't think I've ever known a child empathise with the wrong character per se, but that might just be down to the skill of the person writing the story, in that they're going out there throwing all the techniques in to kind of manipulate children's understanding and attention into who to empathise with. I think if I did find a child who fully empathised with the person who was going to blow up the world with a nuclear reactor,
You'd be ringing
I'd
up
probably, yeah, I'd be putting it in as a safeguarding concern.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marjorie. That was absolutely excellent. I'm picking up the Catch-22 theme. So I asked ChatGPT what they thought, and they said, while Catch-22 incorporates elements of other story forms, such as epic, through its scope and thematic depth, and tragedy, in the sense of the futility and loss experienced by characters, its primary narrative structure and intent aligns most closely to the satire form.
Ah, okay, so this would then be sort of like tangential to Chris Booker's kind of approach, which means that I'm going to have to do some more reading, which I really like.
I think, Bobby, you've got to win there. That's number 8.
I think, is there a spare sticker for Bobby?
Any more on this? Yeah, there's one at the back there. Yeah.
Bill, I knew you'd have something to say.
Marge, that was excellent and so interesting.
Thanks, Bill.
I, as you know, have trained as a therapist, and one of our courses was how to tell stories that heal. And of course, in the early stages of learning about all this was all very new to me, but what I came to understand was working with clients, helping people to bypass maybe their own resistance to change in some area. There was huge value in storytelling. So, for example, there was a technique we use called My Friend John. So the My Friend John idea is that you're talking to somebody about something that, as a therapist, you think they need to maybe move in the direction of. And instead of offering direct sort of instruction in some way, you bypass their sort of resistance to that by telling a story. And the story would be, you know, that reminds me of my friend John. He went to Australia 25 years ago, and you know, he got stuck in this situation, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then John found the solution by exploring this, that, and the other, you know? And I just wonder, because children so easily go into that sort of trance state, and really, this is another whole thing, but the power of stories to induce a trance state is so important, and I'm sure you see that all the time with young children. but I just think it's an interesting thing to think of storytelling as a therapeutic technique that's of great value.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we never really grow out of our need for stories, do we? We've experienced in my school a huge number of bereavements in the last 5 years. For the last 4 years in a row, I've been teaching children in my class who have been bereaved either whilst I've been teaching them, whilst they've been in my class, or the year before. And one of the first things that we do is we make sure that the families have got lots of storybooks that very gently reflect perhaps some of the feelings and experiences that those children in our care go through. But for adults, I feel that it's just as important. I mean, I feel that probably everybody here, I'm guessing, has read a book where you've read it and thought, oh, hard relate. You know, I remember when such and such happened to me, and I think books and storytelling have an incredible power to help us through some of the hardest things that we face. So yeah, completely agree.
I have one more thing I want to throw in, if you don't mind, if you'll forgive me.
No, go for it.
Dreams. We all of us go to bed every night and we dream. Mostly we don't remember our dreams. But yet our dreams, when we do remember them, they're the most extraordinary generators of stories imaginable and take us in all sorts of flights of fantasy. And it's just like we accept that this happens, as we don't really think about, but it is quite extraordinary, this dreaming process, because we're actually physically paralyzed while we're dreaming. I don't know if you realize this or not, but your motor muscles are incapable of action in the dreaming state, because you would act out all these dreams and start moving around and killing whoever's next to you in the bed, perhaps. But it's just an amazing thing that in itself, like that's 1/3 of our experience of being alive is in the sleep state, and a big chunk of that is involved with dreaming as well, which of course is none other than storytelling. I leave you with that thought.
Love it. Bill, thanks, Bill.
There's one more here in the corner. Barbara. Any more? Just so I get an idea if he wants to ask anything.
Hello, it's me in the corner. I just wanted to pick up what you said, Marjorie, and this is just a statement, not a question, so forgive me. You said that you have worked with bereaved children. I was very involved for a long time with a charity that helps bereaved children because of my own experience. And one of the things we discovered, and the therapeutic work that we did with children, was that they got very muddled about the story of the loss of a parent. So they couldn't tell that story to themselves in the right order. They didn't know what had happened. Maybe an ambulance had come and then mummy or daddy had died, but then they were alive again. And one of the most powerful things we did with them therapeutically was we helped them to tell their story from start to finish. And we did it as a film strip with pictures. And once they had that, they owned their own story of the tragedy, and it really helped them heal.
Oh, yeah, that's fascinating. I'd like to look into that more, because actually, and I hope that Mum doesn't mind me saying this, but Bertie had a really interesting response to seeing lots of pictures of my dad around the house. And Bertie, I think, said something quite entertaining when he said, Babaji's gone, Granny came back. So actually, small children and young people's understanding of the kind of the timeline of death, I think, fascinating.
There we are. I think we'll do. If you want to, you can go direct. I think afterwards. And any more for any more. It's been a very, very interesting talk, and you've obviously inherited your father's, curiosity and sensitivity and thoughtfulness, and a very, very interesting discussion. So thank you very much indeed for leading us in it. Thank you. Brilliant. Well done.